Hi, Kaleb Aylsworth here for CG Tuts, and you're watching 3ds Max 2010, the Graphite Modeling Tools. This is part 2 of the tutorial, the practical application, and the software that we will be using is of course 3ds Max 2010. Our focus will be on using the Graphite Modeling and freeform modeling tools in place of the standard tools to optimize your traditional modeling workflow, and to demonstrate this, I will be modeling this cool subtropical sort of tree that you see in front of you. So let's get started. Okay, so now that I've showed you the graphite modeling tools and some of the freeform tools, I'm just going to do a brief little demo here of how to use some of those tools in a regular, everyday sort of workflow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to model this cool little tree concept that I found off the internet. So I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to go get right to it. So I'll bring up my quad view here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a plane, some kind of ground plane. Sorry, that's the wrong view there. Need that to be the top view. Try that one more time. So I'm just going to take a standard primitive plane, drop it in, and this is going to be my ground plane for the tree to grow out of. And I'm just trying to get it roughly around the same size as what I think it should be for the surface area of the image there. That looks to be about alright. Now I'm going to convert it to a poly using my graphite tools. And I need to get some topology for what I'm going to do next. So I'm just going to give it a quick extrusion, just to give it a little bit of height there, and you'll see why in a second. There we go, we have some thickness now. And I don't want it to be a perfect square, that won't look very good. So that's why I added the extrusion, because if you try to add a turbo smooth modifier to a plane, or anything that's a flat polygon like that, it won't round the corners when you add subdivision. But if it's got a little bit of thickness, a little bit of height to it, then when you add that turbo smooth modifier to it, it will start to add a little bit of thickness. So that's what I've gone and done there. I'm going to convert that back to a poly so I can begin working on it. So now I've got a nice sort of round little surface. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to my freeform tools, and I'm going to use the push-pull tool that I showed you before. Now by holding Control and Shift, I'm going to scale the radius out, and we'll test how the default strength is. So just by left-clicking, I'm just going to start painting some form onto this plane to try and flesh out that hill that the tree is growing out of. And so far so good. Again, holding Control Shift, I'm going to scale it down a little bit to try and add a little bit more finer sort of details to it. And it's really quick and easy. You can see how I can really easily and quickly paint some form onto this polygonal surface to try and flesh out the environment that this tree is growing out of. I'm going to scale it down a little bit more, and maybe bring up the strength ever so slightly. Just try to get a few little bump sort of variations onto it. I'm not going to subdivide it down to a really low subdivision, or sorry, high subdivision level. I could if I wanted to, and I could actually go in and add a lot of really unique little details, almost like sculpting or painting geometry or painting topology in some of the other sculpting programs like ZBrush or something like that. But for the scope or purposes of this tutorial, I don't have enough time to really get in with all the nitpicky stuff. So I'm just going to add a little bit of bumps in there and call it a day. Start moving on to the next part. I just want to add a little bit more form to that hill. It seems to be kind of small. Need a little more strength there. Again, as I showed you before, to adjust the strength, you just hold down Shift and Alt, and that will adjust the strength of the brush. Okay, so I think I'm pretty happy with how that looks. Actually, I'm going to rewrite that portion a little bit. Okay, that looks about good. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Shift brush that I showed you before, just to add a little bit of change to the edges of this little surface, just to make it look a little bit more interesting, because just having it all the same level, or the same height, doesn't look very natural or organic, and this is sort of an organic type of subject. So as much as I can with the amount of time that I have, I want to try to make this look as organic as possible, maybe like the grass is like sloping down or something like that. I'm not going to be able to add materials or anything like that, so I'm just going to have my geometry. But this could actually start to look really cool if I could, have time to start putting alpha planes with grass hanging down and stuff like that. You can get an idea of where I could end up going with it. That's about all the time that I have to spend on the environment portion on the ground. So I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to select it, and I'm going to freeze it so I can start working on the tree. And I'm just going to save it really fast because I don't want to lose my work. So I'm going to save it as number 2. Now, to do the tree trunk portion, I'm just going to start off with the standard primitive cylinder. I'm going to add that into my scene in quad view in my top view. I'm just going to try to move it into position and then turn on X-ray mode and try to rotate it to the angle that the trunk starts out with. It looks to be a little bit too big, so I'm just going to scale the radius down. And also, I don't want to actually make it the height of the tree right now, because I'm going to use another operation to actually extrude the rest of the trunk out. So I'm just going to make it about the same height as the base of the trunk, and that should be fine for me. And I think 12 sides looks okay. So again, I'm going to convert to poly. And then at this point in time, I know I'm not going to need the base of it, so I'm just going to delete that portion. Then I'm going to get out of quad view here so that we can get a better look at what I'm doing. Now, I'm going to be hitting a few hotkeys here to navigate around in my views. And if you're not sure what those are, it doesn't really matter. Whichever way you need to navigate around, whatever's your preference. I like to use hotkeys to switch between front view and perspective view. So if I do that, don't concern yourself with it too much. Just whichever way you need to navigate, that's how you go ahead and do it. Right now what I'm doing is I'm just trying to shape or flesh the trunk out a little bit here. Try to match it up a little bit more with the shape of the base of the trunk. Again, I'm going to go back to that shift tool that I showed you before. This tool is really handy for organic stuff. Rather than trying to manually position all the verts, you can just use your fall off and your hot spot and kind of go in there and just nudge things around until you get the shape that you were looking for. And this is starting to look okay to me. I think I want about one more loop in there. So I'm going to go back and use that good old Graphite Modeling Swift Loop tool. Now, I don't like the flow of that geometry there, so I'm going to constrain to edge, switch to the rotation tool, and when you use the edge constraints and you select an entire loop like that, then it will actually just follow along the sides of the cylinder, even though you're rotating it. So that's a very useful technique. You'll see me use it a lot, so I'm just going to explain it this one time. That's what I did. I just constrained to edge and then switched to the rotate tool and rotated it, and the loop followed the form of the cylinder. So now that I'm fairly happy with the base of the trunk, with what I've got there, I'm going to use a little handy technique that I showed you before called extrude along spline. So I'm going to go back to my freeform tools, And in my front view here, I'm going to freehand draw a spline in my viewport. Excuse me. This spline tool can be a little finicky sometimes. Hold on there. It's doing something funny. Try that one more time. I'm not sure why that's doing that. These tools are relatively new, so I'm not 100% familiar with all of their nuances. This should be working. There we go. Not sure why it wasn't working before, but it's working now, and that makes me happy. So I'm just going to use this freeform spline drawing tool. I'm going to draw a spline all the way along the length of the entire trunk of the tree, way to the very end. And that looks okay to me. So now what I can do is I can actually go in and select that spline that I just created. And if I want to, I can convert it and start to move its various different points around. As you can see, because it was a freehand spline, it has a ton of points. So I'm not going to want to try to mess around with them too much. I can always nudge the geometry layer. Right now, I just want to align the origin of the spline with the center of my tree trunk, if I can. So that's what I'm doing. I'm just moving these points on the spline so that they're aligned with the center of the stump of my tree trunk. And that looks good to me. Just check the top view, and yes, it's not lined up. So I'm going to move it over and align it with the center of my tree trunk from the top view. Everything looks pretty good to go. So now I'll go back to my polygon mode. I'll select the sort of cross-section endpoint of the trunk, and then I'll go over to polygons, extrude on spline, hold shift to get the options, and it will ask me if I want to pick a spline, so I will pick the spline that I just drew. And because this trunk is very long and winding, I'm going to ramp the segments way up, probably to around 25 or 30. That looks okay to me. Then I'm going to bump up the taper amount so I can get a nice taper to it, and ramp up the taper curve ever so slightly too, until I get a taper that looks something like what I want. And that actually looks pretty good for a first go. I'm pretty happy with that. I'll just give it a quick save again here, because I'm happy with it. And now the last thing I'm going to do here with the trunk, before I start moving on, is I'm just going to cap off the end. So I'm going to give it an extrusion. Not too much, just a little bit. Position it and rotate it ever so slightly. Extrude it one more time, and then I'm going to hit the collapse tool. And that'll just collapse the tip of that end part of the tree down to a single vertex, which is what I want, because I want to have it nice and cleanly ended off. So now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through and reposition some of these loops along the length of the trunk in slightly better positions than the default positions that the extrude on spline gave them. So I'm just going to do that ever so quickly. I'll also go through and use the Swift Loop tool to add additional loops where I find that they are necessary, where I might like them to be. And as I add those loops, I'll select their vertices and reposition them. Now, another thing you'll probably notice here is that everywhere in my silhouette of this tree that I can see a branch extruding, I'm going to add one loop in the center of the branch and one loop on either side of the branch. You'll see why I'm doing that later on, but basically it's just to give myself the right amount of geometry or topology to later extrude the branches, which is what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be using the extrude function or extrude operation to extrude all of the branches as well. So just bear with me here as I go through and ever so slightly tweak the topology of this trunk just to get it looking a little bit more like the image. I don't have a ton of time for this tutorial, so I'm not going to make it perfect. I'm just going to try to make it as nice as possible with the time that I've got. So far so good though. I think I'm fairly happy with the way it's been going along, the way it's been coming out. Another thing that you can do is you can use loop selection mode or loop mode. Sorry, I still have with loop on there. And you can actually just one-click select your loops just by clicking it once. So it's a little bit easier. It's a time saver, especially for something like this. If you want to go through and sort of rotate and edit your loops in your topology. Single click and you've selected the entire loop around the trunk, which is a pretty beautiful feature in my opinion. Especially when you're dealing with something organic that has a lot of loops in it, like a tree or a character or anything of that nature. This feature is a huge, huge time saver. So it's definitely something to become acquainted with and get used to its functionality. And start using it a lot, like all the time. So far, pretty good. Feel like we're almost there. Some of these loops aren't matching up perfectly. Again, you know, if you want to go through and nudge the silhouette around ever so slightly, you can always go back and use that shift tool and the freeform tools as well, just to sort of drag things around. This is sort of a wonky kind of tree, tropical sort of tree, so it doesn't really have that uniform shape or uniform taper that a lot of deciduous arboreal kind of trees have. This one is going to have more of that undulating sort of off-kilter silhouette and shape. So I'm just going to use this nudge tool again, or shift tool, sorry, to nudge some of these details around. Try to match the silhouette a little bit better to the concept. And again, you can see how quick and easy and friendly these tools are. They just save so much time. It's really unbelievable, and I'm so glad they added them into the software. Just a few more loops to edit. I don't quite like the polyflow of this loop here. And that's starting to look a little bit better. And I think that's going to be okay. The last thing I'm going to do now, because I've been looking at it in a side view the entire time, I'm just going to look at it, sorry, a front view. I'm just going to look at it from more of a side view and try to nudge a few more of these details around in a slightly different view, just to give it a little bit more of that variation. Try to make it look a little bit more natural. And there are some other ways to do this too. I could also use the push-pull feature just to try and actually grow some of the geometry out. But I'm pretty happy with what this shift tool is allowing me to do right now. So I'm just going to stick with that. It seems to be doing its job alright. A little bit more. I like how uniform this portion of the trunk is looking. Excuse me. I'm not exactly happy with how this base portion of the trunk is looking. So we'll just try to nudge some of that geo around a little bit more. And I think that's about all the time that I have to spend with the base trunk. So the last little thing that I'd like to do with it is I'm going to throw on the NURMs and put the subdivisions up to 2 just to see how that would look if it were subdivided. And I think it looks pretty good. So We'll turn the mirrors back off. And we'll save it one more time. Now the next thing that I would like to work on is I would like to work on some of the branches. So remember before I mentioned how I was going to be adding geo in where each of the branches connect. This is the time when that extra geo that I added is going to come in handy. So all I'm going to need to do here is select the central vert where I want the branch to extrude from, and then I'm going to hit chamfer. And when I chamfer it out, I'm going to make a nice little space where that vert or that branch can extrude from. I'm going to turn on ignore back facing, and I'm going to select these vertices, all of them, and then I'm going to weld them together. Now you'll notice that I have a triangle here, and also that these verts have come a little bit close together. So I'm just going to slide those out. And now to get rid of these triangles, actually everything seems to be quads with this function. So by collapsing those verts over, I managed to keep everything nicely into quads. And that'll come in handy later when I want to subdivide everything. Now, this extrusion space here is looking a little bit out of proportion. The branch is going to be very narrow and not very wide if I do it this way. So I'm just going to scale that diamond shape out till it looks a little bit more like a diamond. And then same with the surrounding verts. I'll just scale them out to preserve the flow a little bit. And that looks pretty good. So now, if you remember what we did before, all we did was we went over to freeform and we drew a spline for the extrusion. I'm going to do the exact same thing this time for this branch. I'm not going to be very careful or very picky because it's an organic sort of shape to begin with. So there's no reason to be very picky, just as long as it pretty much fits the shape and the concept, which I think it does. So now we'll go back to our trunk, select the polygon. Oh, no, I have to line up my spline again. I'm sorry. Go to top view, drag my spline over, and line it up as best I can with the center of the branch. That looks pretty good. Now we'll go back, select that polygon, same thing as before, extrude on spline. And there we go. I hadn't picked the shape yet, so it was giving me some weird sort of stuff there. But by choosing the shape, it seems to be working out okay. But I'm going to readjust the taper, the segments, and the taper curve. I think actually segment-wise, about 35 is going to be necessary this time because it's really long. I won't have time to really optimize it in this tutorial, but you could later go back and use the Graphite Modeling Tools, as I showed before, and really quickly and easily pull loops out. And that would really optimize the flow here. In fact, I may have to actually add a few more loops in the end here. No, I don't think it's necessary. I can just go through and adjust the poly flow, and that should be enough. I don't think I'll need to add any additional loops. And yeah, I think that looks fine. And I'll give you a very, very quick demo of how I would go about going through and optimizing some of this geo if I don't need it, which I don't need everything that the extrude function created. So a really quick and easy way to optimize this geo is to use that handy little tool which I showed you before called T-Connect. And if I go to edge mode and I go to P-Connect, holding down Shift and Control allows you to remove edge loops. So you can really quickly go through and pull out unnecessary, unneeded edge loops. And really, really quickly bring down the overall topology of your base model with very little time at all. So there I've just pulled out a few of them, and it's already reduced the poly count that was originally generated by probably nearly half. So that's pretty good. It's a pretty fast function. Don't have too much time to do more than that, so I'm going to go ahead and add a few of the other branches. So same function as before, except I'm going to try and do all of them at once now if possible. So I'm going to select all of the vertices where I would like to extrude branches. I'm missing a loop. So I'll go back to edge mode, swift loop, drop that in, and loop mode, drag that loop over to match the silhouette, and that looks pretty good. Just double check and make sure I'm not missing any more geometry so I can do this operation. And that looks pretty good. We'll come back to these roots later, but I'll just add a little bit of the topology in there for them as well. That looks good enough for me. So, oh no, I need to add one more. Back to swift loop, move that over. Okay, that looks good. So, vertex mode, turn off swift loop, and I'm going to go through and select all of the vertices where I would like to extrude a branch. I'm going to do the chamfer operation on all of them at once, just to save myself some time. So here I'm going and selecting all of the vertices. And looks good. Chamfer. Just take a look how these chamfers are doing over here. They look pretty good all the way around the trunk. I think it's safe to say that I'm happy with that. So we'll say OK. I'm going to have to go along and, again, with ignore backfacing turned on, I'm going to have to weld all of these extra unneeded verts. Weld them over. I'll probably have to nudge some of these loops around as well to make sure that I have my nice quads that I want. Just continuing on, selecting all the vertices. It's really important to make sure that you have a good topology, a good quad sort of polyflow around your entire model when you're going to be subdividing, which I am at the end of this. I'm going to be subdividing everything. So I just want to make sure that I have everything nice in quads, no n-gons, no five-sided faces, and especially no triangles. So that looks good. Turn on the weld dialog. 781 before and 769 after. So that works for me. So we'll say OK. Just looking for areas where I may need to shift some of my loops around on the branches. Now over here I wasn't able to weld these because this triangle or diamond shape is not quite large enough yet. So I'm just going to go to scale mode with the polygon selected and scale on the local axis Excuse me. And another thing that I can do actually is I can shift to vertex mode and then go to edge mode and make sure that it slides along the edges. And that seemed to have worked. So once again, I can just weld these verts together and weld. Looking good. All quads. Moving on. And same thing for the roots here. Looking at the silhouette, I'm going to want to make some of these larger. I believe I still have edge constraints on, so I can easily just scale this up. And that should work out for me pretty well. That's looking good. So now I'm just going to quickly target weld a couple of these verts over. Make sure I don't have any 5-sided faces here. And I'll use the weld operation on the other ones. And that looks good. Let me take a look at the silhouette from these other roots. Yeah, one of them looks kind of small, the other one looks kind of big. So I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm going to go to face selection, hold control, go to vertex selection mode, scale it, and then target weld a couple of these vertices over, and the last one as well, although probably not quite as much. Just try to shift it around a little bit there. Turn edge constraints off and shift it over. And then actually, if I go to my front view, I can look at my silhouette, and I can even try to nudge this in the silhouette to create some even more interesting looking sort of extruded shapes. That looks good. I still need to do a weld here though. So I'm going to hide everything except my trunk. And I'm going to target weld a couple of these verts over. Okay, so it appears as though all the branches, or almost all the branches, are ready to be extruded. Pardon me. I'm going to unhide everything again. And make sure I don't want any of those other branch shapes anymore, so I'm going to delete them. Do one more save. And the last thing is, you'll notice there's this sort of bump sticking out here with 3 branches coming out of it. So I'm going to want to create that bump as well. So to do it, I'm actually probably going to have to draw into some of the geometry here. So I need to create a nice space for it. So I'm going to select some of these verts and move them over. Just try to nudge some of these things around. Make sure I have enough space for this bump. Try to maintain my nice looking topology there, while fleshing out the branch and trying to give the space for that growth or that bump that sticks out there. Okay, that looks pretty good. So now I'm just going to have to take a look at the kind of topology that I have here and see how I'm going to go about extruding this. So from a front view again, just try to match some vertices up to the silhouette. Turn edge constraints on so that when I move the polys or the verts, they follow the flow of the existing edges. And I think overall this is looking fairly good. I'm probably going to have to add in a little bit more topology to extrude the branches. So go back to Swift Loop. I'll add one in there. One there. Actually, you know what? I'll do my extrusion first, and then I'll add the additional topology afterwards. Turn off Swift Loop. kind of move some more of these verts around. And that should be good for my purposes. So now I'm going to make a selection where I would like my extrusion to take place. And that looks to be good. So I'm just going to hit extrude. Extrude it to generally the height that I would like it. Then I'm going to scale it with edge constraints off till I get roughly the silhouette of the shape that I'm looking for. And I think that works. I can probably take the Swift loop and add an additional loop in there. And then maybe scale it ever so slightly, just to round things out a little bit more. That looks good to me. And now I'm going to add in my additional topology so that I can have some room to extrude these branches. So again, I'm going to need 3 loops per branch. And then I'm going to do an inset function so that each branch has its own space to work inside. So I'm going to select my polygons, hit inset, while holding shift to get the inset options. Then I'm going to say OK after giving a little bit of space. Then I'm going to deselect every other vertex, leaving only the 4 outer vertices selected, and scale those in. Let me see, that's not quite working out the way I want it. Okay, turn on P-Connect, hold Control, connect the vertices to the center so I have an edge for them to slide on. Then I'm going to reselect the 4 outer vertices and scale them inwards slightly so that I can round out that branch a little bit. Then I'm going to pull it up a little bit just to give it some shape. And that looks pretty good for a starting point for an extrusion. I'm going to do the same process for each area of the branch that I would like to extrude. So again, P-Connect, Control, and I can connect all of the vertices together just by holding Control and dragging. Then I can turn P-Connect off. I can select the 4 corner vertices, turn on edge constraints, and scale it inwards. And then with my entire selection, I can try to scale it a little bit more to get a uniform shape, turn off edge constraints, and move it up a little bit. And last time, this last branch is rather large, so that's good. Give us some variation. So I'm going to inset, scale it, and then I think I can achieve the effect that I want using a slightly different method this time. So there we go. And I didn't even have to turn on edge constraints that time. Now I've lost some of my smoothing here, so I'm just going to select by element, and then I'm going to smooth all, just to give it all that same smoothing that I want. And I'm going to do another save. And I think we're about ready to start extruding branches. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go through and I'm going to draw spline shapes for every single branch. And I'm going to have to go through and draw them one by one and then deselect. So this might be a little bit of a slow process, but shouldn't take too long. So that has been deselected. Now I'm going to draw my next spline shape along the list here. Just look for where I created shapes for the branches to be extruded.